and delighted to welcome you to our penultimate speaker for our spring speaker series. And it actually is feeling like spring, so I guess we can say that. This sounds a little strange in January and February, but now that the tide is turning, I'll just remind you that next week we are having our last speaker, which is Professor Carolyn Kitch, our own here at Klein College, who will be delivering the last talk. We did have another talk that we unfortunately had to cancel. Well, I should say reschedule. We're still seeking a date, which is Paulo Ramos and her work on Latinx communities. Stay tuned for information about that. As I said, that may have to wait until the fall. We're trying to reschedule it, so I'm sorry for that change. But today we're very, very fortunate to have Dr. Pat Brereton, who is really one of the I think more exciting, more interesting, and a more really politically engaged voices on the topic of environmental communication globally. Dr. Brereton teaches in the School of Communication at Dublin City University in Ireland. His books include Hollywood Utopia, Ecology and Contemporary American Cinema, Continuum Guide to Media Education, Smart Cinema, DVD add-ons and new media audiences, Environmental Ethics and Film, and Environmental Literacy and New Digital Audiences. He's also produced an extensive range of journal articles and book chapters on all aspects of environmental communication and new media. Over the years, Dr. Brereton has also helped promote PhD research in this broad area, while also supporting a number of research projects, including a recently completed EPA, that's the Irish EPA, project on media coverage of climate change in Ireland, and another examining the Irish Citizens Assembly's application of deliberative democracy around the topic. He is currently chair of the Climate Change Masters Program at DCU, Dublin City University. It's an exceptionally exciting and innovative program, which I think is world-class, and so I congratulate Dr. Brereton on that. And Secretary for an Environment and Science Subcommittee at the Royal Irish Academy, and remains actively involved in all aspects of environmental literacy in Ireland and elsewhere. His talk today is Environmental Literacy and New Digital Audiences, based on his recently published book. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over and welcome Dr. Pat Brereton.
Thanks, Patrick. It's great to be with you, if only virtually. I had a lovely visit to your university, I don't know, was it 2 years ago? And I really was impressed. We have a lot of connections between DCU and Temple and your area, in the sense that we have a lot of practical based programs as well. So I'm sort of, I would hope, and I know I'll talk to Patrick again, that we could encourage more research between our universities and in this broad area, which is growing exponentially, I would suggest. So it's a fruitful area of research that we need to make lots of cross-disciplinary connections and whatever. So as I say, as Patrick was saying, I'm just going to talk mainly about this book, my last book on sort of environmental literacy. So it's a survey, or it's just an overview, but I'm more than happy to take questions afterwards if you have any points that you're not getting. I'm just trying to give a sense. So if I was to summarize what I'm trying to do in this book, is I'm trying to move away and link in sort of film literacy and film environmental communication into broader media. So and not just sort of film. So I'm looking at other new media. So I'm particularly interested in the affordances of conventional media, but how they can sort of feed into new media as well. So looking at fictional film, documentary, nature film, television series. I really spend a lot of time watching Netflix. It's great as academics, we can have our pleasure rewarded by writing about it. So I really got into a lot of Netflix and YouTube, sort of YouTube and online environmental programs and sort of platforms because again, we have to connect with a new generation of students. So we need to sort of be aware of what's happening and find new ways of connecting with this. So how to, a key question I keep having with myself and with other scholars is how to make it, how to be more effective in our getting across our environmental messages. And it's no easy challenge in the current climate where things are getting worse. I've been at loads of meetings of late where in Ireland here our water quality is getting worse, our sort of fears of lots of issues. And I know in America it's similar sort of things. And yet we have our COVID crisis that's keeping everyone focused. But what I'm really seeing is, and in Europe and in America, we're talking about building back better and trying to sort of re-engineer the climate crisis in a new paradigm shift as we move into a different sort of agenda. So as an educator, I sort of very much buy into Paulo Freire's sort of comment that we cannot be educators without instilling hope for the future. I mean, I'm an eternal optimist, and it is really hard to be an optimist in our area, but I think we have to be solutions focused. We can see lots of problems, but we need to see how to make the solutions and how we in our media field can help in that challenge. But the backlash, growing backlash towards climate change adaptation, we need a greater emphasis on promoting education and environmental literacy. So by trying to focusing on literacy, I'm trying to bring together media, the old media literacy into environmental literacy and trying to create synergies on these fronts, which I think is really important. What we keep saying in environmental communication is we need to build bridges with all our disciplines. We need to cross connect. And I come from a fairly traditional film studies, but I'm very involved in cultural studies and sort of all types of areas that certainly can cross connect. And I think that's where if we do more of that, we will sort of achieve better results. So linking environmental literacy and education, again, in a long time ago, I did a fair bit I wrote a book on sort of environmental media literacy. So I'm sort of, I was retaking that up and reframing it from an environmental perspective. So as we say in environmental communications, it's not simply a top-down process of disseminating correct attitudes, values, and beliefs. There's a danger, I think, with environmental communication that we're almost become a new clergy. It's almost fundamentalists. We become, you have to be environmentalist, and we wear the cloth sack and we become very preachy, which is a real danger with environmental communication. So how do we allay those fears? How do we sort of engage? And as we say, the big agenda that's always used now in research and communications is co-creating of knowledge. How do we sort of build that sort of a legacy and promoting a dialogue with audiences of different persuasions? As I say to my students in our masters in climate change, we're in a little bubble. They're all environmental communicators. They're very committed, but they're not the people we need to engage with. We need to engage with other people as well. And that's the challenge. That's the real sort of challenge. And I think media and our communications disciplines can help in that challenge. So the old argument, it's not simply about saving the whale or indeed saving local habitats, but it's equally about developing an appreciation of the wonder and beauty of the world and provoking a need to, or a want to save it. So we talk in environmental communications, and lots of scholars in America developed a lot of this, and it goes back to romanticism in literature, the biophilia, the sort of topophilia, the love of nature, how we can sort of engage in that and connect with that through all the arts, through all the humanities, to sort of really sort of engage with audiences where they can relate to their environment and understand sort of the need to take up this challenge, which is a major challenge, as we all know. If you ever go to Paris, go to the Pompidou Center and look down, that's the image you'll see. Well, I saw that when I took the photograph a year or two ago. So raising this debate about what is the relationship between art or media and mass audiences? Are they a conduit for good practice? Are they a way for the big word, the concept we talk a lot about now is using the creative imaginary. How do we create an imaginary images and narratives and new stories and communicate with our audiences in different ways? And we need to find new ways of doing that. And that's where the media are very good in doing that, but we need to be more effective. What colleagues of mine have talked about with regards to press analysis as well as audiovisual analysis is we need more salience. We need more continuous stories on climate change. It can't be just when there's a COP, when there's some incident that happens. It needs to have that salient sort, like what we're learning with COVID. How do we sort of build that narrative continuity about the story? And yet there's a danger in my area of succumbing to blind optimism, that we just find this utopian dream. I had to deal with that a lot with my first book on Hollywood Utopia, because Hollywood is great for utopian images, but as we know, it's trying to understand the dystopic and balance of trying to do some change. It's great to have ideas, but how to make it work. So we would all agree with avoiding the risk of veering too close to what Kellner refers to as manipulation theory, that we're going to just make everyone green. We sort of green the media and that will make everyone environmentally aware. I mean, that's far too naive, far too simplistic, but there's certainly a major role we need to play. So, and we also avoid conceptualizing the audience as a blank screen that Stuart Hall wrote about, that they're just there to be, we need to just make them aware and then they will suddenly turn around and become good environmentalists. It's like everything we say when we're teaching about the media or about environment, it's more complex than that. Everything is complicated. So media literacy theory, again, has a long history, and your colleagues in America have been very good on this, but one of the definitions is the ability to access, analyze, and communicate messages in a variety of forms. So everyone sees media literacy as good because we worry about fake news at the moment. We worry about lack of media literacy. So, but there are new types of literacies written about endlessly now. So we talk about information literacy, digital literacy, ICT literacy, new media literacies, and there's really good books by all these people on them, and social media literacy. And in the book, I sort of draw on their types of literacies and see how we can learn from environmental literacy. Is there new ways we can adapt to broaden our literacies to include environmental and sort of make that connect with audiences as well? So media literacy has a primary purpose of knowledge, information, analytical competencies, and we keep going on about in media communications about critical thinking and critical literacy. We want our students to engage in that area and not just be passively consuming media. So we keep sort of seeing that, and that's the sort of the debate that I try to talk about with the ones I'm talking about. We sort of can, as a sort of a basic rule of thumb, we can say that all sustainable human activities are dependent on a clean, healthy, and productive environment. I mean, that's a given. And I think we all accept that. And I think that maybe isn't said often enough to audiences, and we need to make that clear. So all human activities has a consequence for the environment, both positive and negative. I think a real problem with environmental communication is, and especially with regards to climate change, is that we're the enemy. Unlike COVID, where we can isolate and we can have a war on a virus, in climate change, it's more complicated because we are part of the problem, our consumption, our behavior patterns and whatever. So that makes it very difficult to deal with audiences and understanding that. We have lots of cognitive dissonance. We have lots of debates that people might, yes, agree with it, but they can't go any farther than that. So environmental literacy is essentially the capacity to perceive and interpret the relative health environmental systems and take appropriate action to maintain, restore, and improve the healthy systems. I think as environmental communicators, we can learn from COVID and very much see that we need to connect more with health issues. And that's the real kicker that sort of get audiences mobilized. Once health is involved, then people sort of do connect. Because a lot of environmental communications is perceived as a very middle class phenomenon. It's okay for the rich and the upper classes who want a nice environment, who want to conserve. But for poorer people or different sort of people, it's survival, third world issues. In the book and in sort of 101 environmental communication, we talk a lot about the power of big data or the use of graphics. And as we see in our climate change research center, the scientists have proved climate change. It's maybe some climate deniers around the world, but there's 89% or 98% consensus around the science. It's now a social science and a humanities issue. We need to sort of try and make that sort of connection and sort of drive that sort of behavioral change. What I would argue with regards to a lot of environmental communication is that a lot of the general public are not numerate literate. We're not scientifically literate. So we see graphs, we see lots of this, and it doesn't really sort of connect in the same way. Whereas Al Gore in his famous documentary used very much excessive graphics, big sort of screens, massive, to really dramatize the PowerPoints, to really get across the message. And they were very effective in how they do that. So we're looking at what we can learn from that into the future, how we can communicate the science in a more interesting way or in a more engaging way. I'm quite critical of his sequel, and again, I've written about that in the book. I just think there's issues, and I can talk about that if you want to. And I don't like being critical of Al Gore. I certainly don't want to be, but there are issues that, again, it's about, is it just speaking to the bubble of environmentalists? What about people who are outside of that bubble? And is that the problem that we need to be connecting with? In the sort of mainstream in the book, I just did again, I can never get away from films. So I do a couple of films that I do a close analysis of. So I analyze a film called The Passengers. And it's, if you haven't seen it, they're trying to escape to another planet. And they have to, one character is suddenly woken up and he has to try and survive. And it's sort of, they end up making this beautiful landscape, sort of artificial plants and whatever. And it's just, again, what we do a lot in eco film studies is we sometimes read against the grain. We read a narrative to try and unpack an environmental message that may not be explicit in the film, but it's there in the subtext. And so we're trying to build a space. It's a bit like feminist studies did the same with sort of heteronormative or patriarchal narratives, where they would try and read and get a counter narrative within films from the 40s to the 50s. So eco film studies does similar sort of things. So again, I just do a close reading of the garden sequence to see this romantic heroic ending. And again, this going into nature is always a common trope in a lot of Hollywood films, where nature is where you can resolve tensions and contradictions and sort of help to sort of bring back some positives into the storyline. I also read a film, Sully, which I'm sure some of you have seen. So again, after 9/11, my God, we needed some good stories. A horrible sort of fear of flying was very prevalent. So we had a real life story where a plane had to force land on the Hudson, had nothing to do with terrorism, but it was really because of a bird incident. It was because of a flock of birds. So I'm trying to write for the birds and trying to give them space, since they're the sort of the culprits in the story. But really, we need to sort of, how do we we talk a lot about environmental communication, try to flight shame, try to sort of, and with COVID now where none of us are flying, and it's big thing in universities at the moment. I know our budget for travel in DCU was zilch last year, which I'm sure is true of a lot of universities. So how do we change academics' behavior to fly less? And that's me unselfishly wanting to be over there, but we can see the benefits of not flying from an environmental perspective. But this film is sort of very much, the subtext is about the birds who are doing fly as birds do, and they get sucked into this plane and it brings down the plane. So the story is very anthropomorphized. It's about humans, which we always privilege, but we don't get the story of the birds. And I think there's a real issue that, as an analogy, I would suggest that in alternative energy, particularly here in Ireland and elsewhere with wind farms, anti-wind farm protesters will always raise the bird issue, that birds get caught in the wingspan of the alternative energies. But it's never, that argument isn't often used to stop people from flying. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy going on. But again, you can read the story, or I can tell you more about that if you want. I mean, as a Blade Runner fan, I mean, Blade Runner is the text for a lot of postmodernist studies. So in my Hollywood Utopia, I would have a deep reading of Blade Runner. Again, I'd love to hear your comments, but I wasn't as taken by the sequel, even though colleagues really loved it. But I particularly liked the evocation of the farmer, the replicant farmer in the sort of thing. So can we create new modes of environmental literacy? So I'm trying to see, I've written a lot about farming and its representation, because that's a huge issue in Ireland, because we have over 35% of our carbon emissions is from methane emissions from excessive factory farming of cattle and dairying and whatever. So we have a real issue with that. So the representations of farming in Ireland, as in elsewhere, is often sort of posited in a binary way between the spoilers of the planet, because they're so intensive. And I know in America, the intensive farming is really big, versus nurturing and protectors of the landscape. So this binary tension is played out a lot in representations of farming or in characterization. So I'm trying to reimagine a different sort of representation of farming that could be sort of in a different way. So Sapper Morton and how he's used. So it's not the usual nostalgic image of nurturing farmers. In Ireland, we have a great film called The Field from John B. Keane. It was originally a play, but it's about the land and needing to own and control the land. And that's part of, lots of people would argue, is a post-colonial discourse in Ireland, where we want to own our land because we've been displaced for so long by the British, that's part of the narrative. But how that sort of is reimagined in an environmental discourse where everything is connected, and trying to promote organic farming and different forms of farming where we all need to eat less meat and try to produce a different, more sustainable agricultural system. That's a huge debate in Ireland, as it is elsewhere. Sorry. So that's himself, and some of you might know him. So again, I just do a close reading of that sequence where he gets, I give it away, he gets the job. What really interests me in this book was as I said at the outset, my fascination with long play television series. I think they're up there with Shakespeare. I see that the quality of a lot of these American sort of dramas, from the HBO to whatever, because they have the time and the space, they can really reimagine narratives in a very complicated and a sort of excessive way, rather than the 2-hour film narrative. These have really come to its own, and I think some great writing is happening on it as well. So the capacity to reveal the complexity of human nature and characters, and John Parnham has written well on it as well as John Cowie. the extension of time where we invest so much in a long play series, it allows us to engage in a very complex way, I think, with characters where we really get involved in the nuance of character and space and place and storyline. So I'm sort of trying to big up the importance of these long play series. And one of my early favorites was Ozark, which some of you may have seen, but my God, that first episode, if anyone hasn't seen the first episode, it'll blow your mind, literally. But again, it's a standard crime drama where it's all about pulling towards the rural landscape, because finding escape is part of the road movie. It's part of so many narratives, especially in America, which I love vicariously, because I've seen the landscape so much through movies and through whatever. I haven't seen as much of the landscape in real times as I would like to. I don't know the Ozarks, but again, the series connects with that sort of love of nature, but yet in a very counterintuitive way. So the exponential growth of online media and mobile telephony, we have a turn now towards the materiality of media, in the sense that media is part of the problem, as we all know, by producing a digital sort of carbon footprint. And there's a lot of good scholars writing about this at the moment. So we have to be aware of the media's discourse around this. And Netflix is very culpable in this, because it's very high in its carbon emissions. So how does it deal with the myth of endless technological growth? How do narratives frame that? How do they sort of posit a different sort of engagement? How do we go beyond survivalism? Again, someone called Patrick Murphy has written really well on this. So there's really good stuff. I got into zombies from Patrick. I did a reading of Irish zombie movies and farmers. I mean, there's a mouthful. So you can really connect in very interesting ways once you break the binaries and go into different cultural manifestations and find ways of linking sort of different areas. So as Patrick is saying, the example, all these sort of tropes that have become quite sort of prevalent, but can we repurpose them in some way for different audiences? So we need to do this. We need to get new imaginaries. So as film scholars and as media scholars, we're always hunting for something new, a new way of telling that very standard trope of sort of nature being trapped. I really am raving about David Attenborough's Netflix 1 hour documentary. Is the best thing I've ever seen on environmental communication. And again, if you haven't seen that, please look it up on Netflix. But Attenborough at 97 is now reimagining his whole history of nature documentaries and positioning it clearly within an environmental context as he dovetails between the Chernobyl at the start and end of that 1 hour thing. It's really good if you haven't seen it. So I'm trying to look at a Rorschach text. Psychology is really important. Can we get some stimuli that actually could spark an environmental agenda or an environmental debate? So I did a close reading of Tony Soprano's overconsumption of Sopranos is a great series, but again, trying to read Sopranos from an environmental context is quite suspect maybe, but I think there's clear agendas going on that have an environmental context. So I sort of look at that in an interesting way. I also look at Homeland in this book, which is very much speaking obviously to the fear of the other in a post 9/11 context, but there is an environmental subtext there as well. So is it promoting a sustainable society? Richard Rorty, I'm sure you know his work. So can these series be explicitly talking about climate change? Usually not, but implicitly, I would suggest, or at least in the subtext. They very much have flawed protagonists. We love flawed protagonists ever since Shakespeare and before. We want characters who we can empathize with. And that's why I think these long play series work really well, because they're really difficult characters, whether it's Carrie Matheson in Homeland. And people who don't like Homeland just don't like Carrie. They can't get, they just find her too much. But The same with Tony. If you like Tony, it's because you can empathize with him. Audience research has shown The Sopranos was really popular with middle-class businessmen, because really they wanted to shoot their bosses half the time, but they couldn't. So vicariously, this became a way of sublimating their fear. So we can psychoanalyze a lot of the pleasures that we get. As an academic and as a teacher, we all like Breaking Bad, or do we? Or Better Call Saul, two fantastic series that, again, if you haven't seen during COVID times, if you want hours of pleasure, I think they're phenomenally good in the complexity of their characterization, but also I read them from an environmental agenda. So they pick on issues, but they don't preach. And that's where they work, I think, in connecting with issues, and finding ways of doing that is really important. Money is the enemy. We all know that. We all know the capitalist system is the enemy, but it's harder to end capitalism than have a revolution, or we have loads of debates around this. Lots of us academics tend to be on the left, trying to marry left and green politics. And the tension at the moment, as I see it in writing the book, I'm trying to write a very basic book for students, is obviously between green growth and degrowth. So, some want to end capitalism first because we can't change the climate otherwise. Others say, can we re-engineer capitalism and systems? And there's tensions between all debates, but the American narratives are really good at signaling the power and the corruption of the dollar, of money, capitalism, and whatever. And Sopranos does that as well as any other drama series. The psychology of surveillance obviously has become really, especially with fake news, especially with the whole agendas that's going on across the world. Again, trying to sort of reimagine Carrie as a nurturing feminine female character is difficult, to say the least. So she's quite complex in her evocation, but again, I sort of just do a reading of her to try and see how it can see an environmental context. This fake news argument on creating memes that could be repurposed in different ways. In politics, that's the big area of big data and analysis. We've had in environmental communications our climate gate in London, in England. We've had negative publicity. I think an ex-president of yours might have had some say on that. But how do we reimagine the climate issue and make it the number one and use new media more effectively is something that interests me, and it interests a lot of scholars in environmental communication. So the streaming of narratives, as Patrick was saying, I wrote about smart cinema in an earlier book, and I'm sort of very interested in that smart aesthetic that became very prevalent in the 80s and 90s and the noughties. And I think the televisual narratives also have these very complex smart aesthetics as well, with very complex plots that really sort of hook you in. And often you need to see them a few times to really get into them, because there's so many threads being molded in sort of different areas. Again, I'm just flying through this because I'm just noticing the time, and I want to finish in a few minutes so we can have some chat. The mode of address, again in climate change, I used to work in an insurance company. I do think insurance is one tool that we don't use enough in environmental communication, because it's about, we insure our house for fire and whatever, but insurance can be a way of integrating into a sort of normal practice to sort of we insure against climate change. So I think how to sort of marry and get new ways of telling stories, and sort of in the piece that we did in our Citizens Assembly, where we had to do a project on the effectiveness of the Citizens Assembly as a model for democratic politics. How do we communicate with audiences? And I'm sort of in the readings and research on that, we found, we really need stories. Stories are very important, and they need to be personal and concrete. So, and that's true whether you're trying to do a local waterway sort of investigation, or whether you're trying to do big climate change debates and paying carbon taxes. you need to balance it with personal stories and trying to engage with people on that level. You need to make stories vivid and extraordinary. We do need, we're bombarded with media output in all ways. So how do we sort of connect? So I'm interested in filmmakers and other scholars who are finding ways of telling new stories. We keep telling our students show, don't tell, and make them humorous and witty. In environmental communication, we need to find some humor. It's a hard one, but there is I know queer theorists are really finding good parodies that are being played out. And we need to find them whether it's sort of a satirical animation or whatever, we need new narratives and new ways of telling the story. We need to re-engineer society. It's a paradigm shift we talk about. How do we make this reverse gear? How do we sort of make this, you know, the left has been trying to change the world into a socialist utopian for a long time. How do we now reimagine our environmental challenges and really change the system? So how can the media help in that? So that's something John Urry, the late John Urry, is a great writer. It's a good book from 2013 if you want to read it on that. So the rules of environmental communication: make it local, make it visual, make it connected. So documentary filmmakers can certainly do that, and other filmmakers can find that model. YouTube is where my students go to for when they want to find out anything. So it's like a bespoke, big sort of thing that they'll all go to. And I'm saying, oh God, don't go there. We hate you doing that. Go to authoritative sources. Why are you doing that? So it's, as we know, I presume it's a very popular, hugely popular since it came out in 2005. It's a preferred research tool, God help us, but it is. That's what they're using it for. Can it be, yeah, I've just finished a lecture just before this on television studies. John Hartley has this argument that television took over the bardic function that used to be a pre-electric. In the pre-times, people would sit around a fire in Ireland and tell stories. So television took on that bardic function, according to John Hartley. Can we argue that YouTube and the online media platforms are similarly creating that bardic function or not? How does it function? How do people read it? Within that, we, one of my PhD students from Uruguay and myself, we did a close analysis of a YouTube rapper called Prince Ia, who did a sort of music video called Sorry. And it's well worth looking at. It got billions, trillions of hits. But we used that to do a media analysis and a sort of an environmental analysis of students, showing it to students and trying to get them to engage with that. So how the new media is affecting environmental communication is something that interests. So again, you will see, you get that from any of the research. Again, these PowerPoint, you can have it and you can give it to people if they want it. So how do we get, I'm becoming more interested in reception studies and audience studies to see how people are there other triggers or other ways of communicating science, the science of climate change. So can we come up with new audiovisual storytelling for the 21st century? I mean, that's the challenge. And I think as an academic, we need to be not just repurposing the past, but try to find new models that might work. What are the new media? Can TikTok be reimagined to produce new fascinating environmental narratives for new generational tweens, etc.? But I have to admit, and the book sort of comes to this conclusion, there is a continuing lack of critical literacy. I'm shocked at our media literacy in our students still. So I still buy into John Barry and John Barry's point. There's a critical lack of media literacy. Or is that just old people looking down on young people that don't have this media literacy? Or is there different literacies we need to talk about? So how to move up from technical media literacy or sort of writing literacy into media literacies. So that's it, folks. Sorry I went on a bit. I just wanted to just get a flavor of that. So I think that's it, yeah. So stop sharing. So I'm just, it's a thumbnail sketch. I'm more than happy to pick up any points. I just didn't want to go on too long. Sorry about that.
No, thank you very much. We have plenty of time for some questions. And why don't we just dovetail straight into that? If you have a question, use your electronic hand or feel free to drop something into the chat. Septime.
Thanks. Good morning, Dr. Brereton. Yeah. And thank you for this. I really enjoyed it, and it's actually part of what I'm trying to focus on in my course of, while being here. So you've talked a lot about, in your conversation. I think one way of trying to see it is how the media is "quote unquote" the appropriate voice, to talk about the environment and whether or not they're doing it adequately. So one question would be, should we be looking at it in this respect? Like, who has the appropriate voice? Is it the media or is it anyone else? And on that, I wanted to tie it to another question, which is, what can we learn from the youth, from those new environmental movements? I can only talk about, Greta Thunberg and then this wave of youth, eco-activists from Africa, from all over the world. So what can they teach us, both in academia, but also in terms of, filmmaking, to either improve how we talk about the environment, or whether or not they are the one who are likely going to give us the direction. And the last thing I want to touch on is the issue of security, which you present as one of the ways of making climate change ring a bell to people, trying to bring it home, by connecting it to health. So we have, COVID, and I'm sure there will be research and literature trying to connect COVID with the environment. And on the security, I'm thinking, for instance, terrorism. I'm thinking, mass immigration. I'm thinking, I'm from West Africa, so in sub-Saharan Africa, we have a growing problem with Boko Haram. And one of the issues is that they go around telling people, we can ensure you having property over your land, when the government is forbidding you from cultivating, from extracting gold, and etc. So how do we connect all of those? And then what's the right way of presenting it? I don't know if my question makes sense.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions there. I mean, I haven't raised at all about the ethics, and I think climate justice is absolutely central to all communications of environmental communication, because I think there's a danger of it being white-centric, middle class, and it's sort of really about first, third world. And we need to learn from race, gender, class, politics, and try to link them all together. So we need to learn from feminist studies, from environmental, from sort of class politics, from race, because there's huge learnings that can have across those divides. I think when you talk about what we can learn from the Greta Thunbergs, and I would put on the other extreme is David Attenborough. So you have the really young and the really old. I think we can learn from both. I think David Attenborough is stunning, the stuff he's coming out with now. I think Laura Thunberg's, the innocence, the purity, the simplicity of the messaging is really powerful, and it speaks to huge generations of young people. We have to learn, and storytelling needs to learn from that. So I do sort of buy into that totally, and I think we need to do more investigations and to see how to make that work. On your security, yes, I do feel that in research in America that said that people will still see terrorism as the biggest fear, because you have the imaginary of the terrorism of 9/11 or of some terrorist attack that can be visualized easier, whereas the climate change issue is more long-term, and it's very hard to get, you can have a bit of flooding, you can have, but it's not in the same league. So I think finding ways to link to health, or sort of finding ways to make that sort of resonant with audiences is really important. Your first point was, what can we learn from, is media the right tool? I'm a media scholar, so of course I'm going to talk about the media, but it's just one aspect. I think media needs to connect with all forms of communication, whether it's telling stories one-to-one, as well as poetry, novels, all forms of art. So I wouldn't limit it just to media. I think art has a major role to play in sort of, as we said, coming up with creative imaginaries that really resonate and speak to different audiences. So anything that connects. So as with Prince Ia, it was a rap. I'm not a rapper myself, but by God, it was brilliant because a rap worked with the audience it was connecting with. So we need to get it's like the communication tool or message needs to fit the audience and what they want. So there's just some observations, but can't answer them all. They're very good points.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you, SUB-team, for those questions. Why don't we take a couple, and Gabby and Lucy, and then Joanne and Kate get to you next round. But let's go ahead and take right now Gabby and Lucy first, please. Gabby, you want to start?
Great to see you this morning, Dr. Brereton. I am actually from Klein's Global Opportunities Office, so hoping we can send students to DCU next spring.
Right.
But aside from that, I had a question about something you had mentioned about the vivid and the extraordinary when it comes to conveying environmental communication messages. Have you done any research about animated films, and like, have you explored that genre and maybe connecting it to that the youth connection, I guess I should say?
Will I step in here, Patrick? Yeah, I mean, sorry.
Let's go ahead and let Lucy ask questions.
Okay.
Handle both, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So you touched on this a little bit, but could you talk a little bit more about the role you see your research playing in looking at how the artifacts you're looking at are sort of challenging the media messages that are put out by the corporations and industries that are driving climate change, like greenwashing, and maybe how we could use these messages to hold these harmful systems to account?
Okay.
Is that it, right?
I think with those two, and then we'll
Okay, right. Sorry about that. Gabby, on animation, I've written a lot about WALL-E. There's good stuff on Up. In the book I'm writing at the moment, I'm comparing the Disneyfication of animation that is often seen as more fixed in anthropomorphic terms, that it's not as progressive, versus, let's say, Japanese manga. There's great work done on that. I think they are phenomenally good in its evocation of sort of thing. There's a huge amount of animation that's been made that is very, very good in speaking to. So I think that's a format I'm very interested in. And I think certainly more can be done. And even very mainstream, from The Simpsons down, there's this huge stuff that could be used in how that sort of, from mainstream animation to whatever. So Lucy, I think you're certainly on the money there. I think the corporations, there's a big danger at the moment of greenwashing is a huge issue. I've been reading a lot about greenwashing, and I would be very controversial in some ways that I see greenwashing as a continuum. It's neither on or off. There's variations that some corporations can start playing a greenwashing game, but can be convinced to make it more legitimate. And sometimes we need them to get on board, but there's a lot of sort of really cynical sort of advertising campaigning going on. We all know that sort of sustainability is the big buzzword that everyone uses now that can mean whatever you want it to mean. But we talk in environmental communications that the 1% of corporations and massive people are still contributing the huge amount to the system. So we need to get these big corporations to change. So I think we need to be less nice and call people out and call corporations out. So I think we've organized, I don't know whether you have Extinction Rebellion in America, but here I would support quite radical sort of, and obviously keep it in the ground for fossil fuels, but we need to extend that. We even have that with our own research center that we have at the moment. We're looking for funding, and we're certainly not going to take it from anyone that we have any hint of greenwashing. So, and I think young, as we keep saying, young people now are getting the message. They won't work in companies that haven't got a good green reputation. So I think there's a shift going on, but it's not happening fast enough. And the media needs to step up and really call out corporations that are not doing the right thing with regards to their social responsibility and whatever. So I think that's a big issue that everyone needs to get involved in. Absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you for those questions. Let's go ahead and take two more. Joanne, if you can go first, and then Kate, and then Professor Brereton, if you can handle those two. Yeah. And we'll go on. There's a couple more hands. Yeah.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much for speaking today. While I was listening to your presentation, it actually really resonated with me and actually connected to the capstone that I'm working on. So I'm doing a sort of sustainable digital communications, but I was specifically working in a rural community, my own community, and I realized that there's a lot more than the digital aspect. There's a big in person. And especially because of my past work conducting in-depth interviews with rural community members about the environment and flooding, and like there are people that are having their homes completely like flooded in and being pushed back. I was wondering, how do you see the best way from a communication and media perspective to mitigate a sort of like community tribalism when conducting environmental communications in those communities affected by climate change that are very off-put by the term climate change, because it's been made a politically charged term due to like, I guess like, it's always kind of turned into a culture war based off of like maybe Fox News or CNN, or just like people who are in charge of making this political paradigm, and how to like, we mitigate that, like how do environmental communicators mitigate that sort of issue and use neutral language to encourage people to be engaged in a way that maybe doesn't sound great to an environmental scientist, but makes sense to the everyday person that's being affected. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for talking today. My question is very similar to Lucy's, so if you don't have much to add, that's fine. I was sort of interested in your opinion about these films, as you mentioned, that sort of recenter humans or center humans in issues of environmentalism, but also center corporations. I was thinking specifically of films like Deepwater Horizon, which almost rebranded the BP oil spill as something different. Like just by renaming that film Deepwater Horizon, it almost diverts attention. It's kind of like crisis control, damage control. So I was wondering, I mean, if you kind of see that happening in other films, or if you see films that are doing a better job, or media that are doing a better job of pressuring corporations and not sort of giving them an out or diverting attention from them. So I was just sort of interested in your thoughts on that front. So thank you.
Okay, two great questions. Joanna, the rural communities, I'm very interested in that sort of whole area, because where I come from in the Midlands of Ireland, it's about farming, and they don't like being told what to think. And I would also assert very strongly that the media industries like conflict, because that sort of gets bums on seats. It gets people buying newspapers. So they're almost encouraging conflict, and we need to try and find ways of dissipating that conflict. So as researchers or as scholars in environmental communication, we need to find the truth and step into people's shoes and seeing from their perspective and trying to engage with them on a sort of an equal footing, and in no way speaking down to people, because climate change, we're all culpable. No one is the sort of, I mean that when I say it, it's almost like a theocracy where we're sort of supposed to be wearing the pure sackcloth, that we know the answers, and it's not like that. Environment is really complicated. So you need to empathize. And I think some films have tried to do that, where Promised Land, I don't know if you know it, it's an anti-fracking American movie. But like they go in with the gung-ho PR message, but then they realize, so it becomes compromised in the end. But we need to find ways of finding new ways of engaging that's not going to be just sort of reinforcing and polarizing opinion. I think you have real issues in America, as we know, with Democrats and Republicans very much polarizing sort of society. So how do we cross that sort of ideological divide with a bigger issue of climate change? And that's something that is really needs academics and scholars and researchers to find ways of doing that. So I think that's really important to find, and I don't have the answers, but I think being sensitive, being engaged in whatever. Kate, you're certainly on the money. Films are really compromised in the sense that they do reinforce the business as usual model. Selfishly, as a film scholar, I just like when there's a film that deals at all with the climate, with something. It gives me something to bounce off of. So I try to read against the grain and try to be good to it and positive, just to try and get more. What we need is much more narratives that are across the spectrum and not just there as a sop to try and replay as a PR exercise to get the corporations off the hook or whatever. But I think most, we talk about the polysemic messaging of Hollywood films. There are multiple readings. So even in the most very mainstream narrative, you will still see an environmental subtext or some criticism, but it won't be pushed through in the end or whatever. So I think over the years, I've written about lots of films, and some are better than others. Films like Dark Waters, that's really good on DuPont. And others who are really good in, they have their heart, they really know what they're trying to do and they know how to sort of engage in it. But a lot of them do try to play the game and are not very good. But my argument would be, if at least gets people, audience talking and saying, that's not right, that's good in itself if it gets a reaction. My worry is it's not on the agenda, whereas it should be. The media should have this global issue on the agenda. There's far too few films made in Hollywood to deal with this. With regards to WALL-E, for instance, I noticed when I analyzed the Pixar makers of the film, they said it's not an environmental film because they didn't want to be tagged as environmentalists, because that would ghettoize them into a particular audience. So it's like, oh my God, everyone is playing a game that they don't want to see, that they're being pigeonholed in a particular direction. So that's, I think we have to move beyond that and to get beyond this polarizing of seeing things in just green or it's not green, because climate change is going to affect everything, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's going to be Norway, it's all going to affect in different ways. But there's the key one, going back to what Joanna says, there's a danger of NIMBYism. Not in my backyard. So we just want to protect it's like COVID at the moment. We want the vaccine nationally. We just want, once we're okay, as if that's going to, that we can build a wall. Sorry, I'm getting political here, but we can't with climate change. It's transnational. The key narrative that I keep getting across in environmental communications is everything is connected. So we're only seeing a little bit of the picture when we analyze something. We have to see how that connects with something else. And we have to be humble enough to accept that we don't have all the answers. We need to engage with other sorts of people. But I do believe, and this is blowing our own trumpets as environmental communicators, I think we're the glue to marry a lot of disciplines together. We're the way that we can sort of narrativize across these different disciplines to help see the connections, and that'll keep us in business for the rest of our lives.
Thank you, Pat. If you can extend your time just a little bit, I think probably ask Andrew and James if they can ask their questions, and it might be a nice way to end the session.
Thank you for joining us. This was a wonderful discussion this morning. Two things for you. One is, how, as communicators, do we tell the story of current policy getting us into the situation we're in, to create the policy change, to overcome the kind of overarching narrative that individual actions is what we need to do? So how do we get to policy change? without it becoming too top down, kind of like that rural narrative that you were talking about, without being told to do too much. And as a recommendation, if you haven't seen it yet, I'm curious about your thoughts on a British series that's on HBO here called Years and Years, which really ties together a lot of different things about authoritarianism, surveillance, technology, climate change, immigration. So yeah, that's it. So thank you.
Hi. So over the process of this lecture and in some of the questions, a lot of the focus was on specific narratives and media examples. I have a question more regarding the actual structure of how we produce media. Especially in the United States, we have a lot of individualization where everyone's an independent contractor. You might be with like a firm for, you know, however many years in a single position, but it's this very, you know, hierarchical kind of production mode. Do you think that there are other ways of producing media that speaks more to an eco-friendly kind of process as well as the narrative itself?
Two great questions, and I certainly can't
Let me
answer
interrupt.
them.
I'm sorry, I didn't see Asabi's hand up too. And
Oh, sorry.
let her get her question in, and then
Okay.
I think that'll give us a nice way to end. Sorry.
My interest in coming to hear you speak today, and I really enjoyed everything you said, was how to appeal to youth ranging in age from about 8 to 14 to educate them about environmental literacy, and then to get them moving and how they can express themselves, because there's a lot of great work going on in Philadelphia in terms of environmental concerns. There's a lot of work going on in terms of educating people about the health effects of heat. There's a great heat project. A lot of it is coming around through the arts, through the community arts, and through bringing green canopy to neighborhoods, and about environmental and land justice. And so in appealing to immigrant communities particularly, and to all of the youth generally, I'm looking for ways to introduce them without preaching and without being the authority, to educate them on environmental issues, the effects on their health, the effects on the community. A lot of people are coming from places that were naturally green and lush and luxurious in that sense, to these barren neighborhoods that are concrete and blacktop, and where the trees have been removed, supposedly because of the war on drugs. So it's, you know, bringing youth into awareness of it. I've gotten a lot of great directions from hearing you speak and the different things that you've presented. So yeah, it's a kind of a question statement of just the introduction to youth and how they're going to express themselves and be involved and be excited about the environment that they're living in, and understanding the forces that are over top of them that they're not aware of, that are affecting them, affecting their families, their parents, their grandparents, their kids to come, in terms of heat, psychologically, physically, and health in general. So that's kind of a question statement, but.
Right, it's a great question, and I'd want hours to respond to it. And I think it's something we all need to find ways of dealing with. I do, just a few general comments on that. I do think that primary, second, and tertiary education needs to find linkages around environmental communication, because we all cross over a lot, and yet we specialize. I'm in higher education, but we do need to find ways of cross-connecting. I think with the younger children, they do need to connect to their pleasures, and you cannot, as you say, speak down to them. So find something that interests them, to motivate them, to make them more active, engaged, that they have agency, rather than they're just being sort of told things, sort of find out about their neighborhood and whatever. So again, feel free to contact me if you want, but I think there's lots of really good research on young people's engagement with, there's lots of good programs online for young people. I think it's worth learning from me. I think, as I say, media literacy feeds into environmental literacy. So I think you can find a lot of crossovers there as well, because the kids want to use media. So if you can correlate media literacy with the others, you can do well. Just on James, producing media and individualize, I agree with you, James. I think that's a really good analogy to make. I'm involved in Ireland on carbon calculators, where all the production media companies have bought into what's called the Albert system in the BBC, where they all now are mandated to produce a carbon calculator for all their productions to make sure their CO2 emissions on each project can be reduced. So I think the production model of media needs to change. And that comes from the materialist turn in media studies, where we now know media is a big carbon emitter. So we need to make we can't be preaching a message and the messenger is sort of very suspect. So I think that's a move that's happening a lot at the moment. I would support more cooperative, and going back to what the left was really good at in sort of finding cooperative movements where you break the individualization down and you find commonalities of environmental networks that could set up, rather than reinventing the wheel. So that's, again, I'd love to hear more about that, but I can't go on. On Andrew's point, years and years, I'd love to see it, Andrew. I haven't seen it, so I can't really comment on it. I have a good few colleagues who are looking at policy behavioral change and trying to get policy from top down to bottom. It's a very niche area of research. Again, there's some research that's happening on that, but I think we need, as you well know, about a top down and a bottom up, and trying to get policy to manage that and to get behavioral change around policy. At the moment in Ireland, we've just in the last 2 days introduced a climate bill with our new government. And we're arguing, and what is argued, that it has to meet the Paris Agreement. So they're trying to get the carbon budget to marry this. So it's going to need a lot of detailed policy changes, both from all angles. So I think there's a lot of work there for policymakers around environmental communication to find ways of marrying that top down and bottom up. I don't have an answer, but I can see where that needs to be done, very much so.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you very much, Professor Brereton, for sharing your work, and exciting, inspirational, and had a lot of great questions. I appreciate the investment of time and interest and curiosity. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and more than happy, if anyone wants to send me an email, I'm more than happy to dialogue if anyone wants some further stuff. And I mean it when I said love to build up research links with you guys. So keep in touch. It's only an ocean between us. It's not that far.
All right.